Hello and welcome to the interview here on France24. Our guest today is Antony Blinken, who is the Deputy Secretary of State. He was formerly Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. Mr. Blinken, welcome to the show. We're going to talk mostly about Syria. We're entering, it seems, a new phase militarily with the Russian direct intervention, officially to fight ISIS, but it seems also to support the regime of Bashar al-Assad. In response, we're seeing, it seems, a stepped-up U.S. Response, but it also may be a turning point on the diplomatic front. We've seen a flurry of meetings. You attended one in Paris. There was a meeting last week in Vienna. There is supposed to be a new meeting in Vienna later this week, and the novelty is that Iran has been invited to that meeting. Is this a turning point?
Well, we don't know if it's a turning point yet, but what we do know is that there's been an intensification of the diplomacy led by our Secretary of State, John Kerry, Laurent Fabius here in France, and other key partners in the region. And we all have a common objective and a common agreement, which is that the only way forward in Syria to end the conflict is through a political transition. And what we're working on now is to define that transition with specificity, what the elements would be, to see if we can get a common agreement on that, including with Russia. And then to move forward.
And including with Iran. I mean, let's go back to this. It's an important issue. Iran, there were negotiations about centrifuges, about uranium, and that was it. Now you're saying we're willing to discuss with Iran on ISIS, and that's an important change.
Well, two things. First, all of the neighbors, Syria's neighbors in this case, are invited to the meeting in Vienna on Friday. So that includes Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran. And it's evident that Iran, one way or another, is going to have to be part of the conversation on Syria's future.
But it was not part of that conversation because of its supposedly destructive role in Syria, and that hasn't changed.
Well, there are two things. President Obama has been very clear that he is willing to engage with anyone who is willing to try to work for a peaceful outcome in Syria. And as Secretary Kerry said, Iran, one way or another, is going to be playing a role. Now, unfortunately, to date, it's played a negative role in terms of its support for Bashar al-Assad, in terms of its proxy, Hezbollah, which is helping to prop up the regime. So one of the big questions will be whether Iran is prepared to play a positive role in supporting a political transition. We don't know the answer to that.
The political transition, you mentioned it. If you talk to Russia, if you talk to Iran, Bashar al-Assad's two main backers, you're effectively talking to or with him. This means there's no precondition that he must leave power to discuss. He will be part of a transition. He does not need to leave now.
Our position, and I think the position of most of our partners, is pretty clear.
No, it's not.
Well, we'll see. And Vienna will help to clarify that as well. There is no future for Syria as a stable, secular, democratic, peaceful country with Assad as president. And so any political transition must result in his departure, among other things. The question is how exactly to define that process. That's exactly what we're working on. But there's something new here, and that is Russia's role. And what's happened is this.
Is it a positive role?
Well, this is what's new and what's interesting. Russia's intervention has, on the one hand, increased its leverage with Assad because it's playing a more decisive role in supporting him. But it's also increased the leverage of the conflict on Russia. Russia cannot afford to become mired in Syria. It can't afford to alienate virtually all of the Sunni Muslim world, including 15% of its own population. It has a need to find a way out of what it's gotten into. And indeed, its actions on the ground in support of the regime are not going particularly well. They've made very little progress despite the onslaught of Russian air power. So Russia now has an incentive, and it has more influence to actually try to move Assad and the regime toward a political transition. That's the proposition that we're testing.
From your conversations with the Russians, are they telling you that they can convince Assad to an acceptable transition, that he would leave power in 1 year, 2 years? Is this what they're telling you? And is this why you're trusting them to hold those conversations.
Well, we're at the beginning of this process, and
But you've
the
held
critical
talks with them.
we've had talks, but the critical next step will be the meeting in Vienna. This is not going to be resolved in one meeting or two meetings or three meetings, but it is the beginning of an intensified process to see if we can get to a political transition process. That's exactly what we're working on. I can't give you the answer now. We don't know yet, but I think it's fair to say that no one is wedded to Bashar al-Assad.
Including the Russians
Well, I think you'd have to ask them directly.
and the Iranians.
Yeah, you'd have to ask them. But we'll have an opportunity as a result of these conversations and discussions to test those propositions.
Are the Saudis on board with the Iranians being part of that?
Yes.
We know there's
Yes.
serious tensions between the country. Yes, they
Yes,
are.
the answer is yes.
So you think now the stars are aligned maybe to really find a political solution in the not so distant future in Syria?
Well, they're more aligned than they've been, but that doesn't mean we'll get there. But it does mean that there's a greater opportunity, and I think it's because there's a growing recognition on the part of all sides that there is no military solution in Syria, and that's a recognition that's now growing on the Russians. We've known it for a long time. They're now experiencing it. They cannot win in Syria. They can perhaps prevent Assad from losing, but they can't win. And meanwhile, they will be bled, and their influence will be eroded, and their reputation will be eroded.
Don't you think that in the end, this is an acknowledgement by the US that its Syria strategy has failed, that it hasn't been able to push Bashar al-Assad out, and that because of Russia's intervention, Iran's growing role, they have to find a solution that was not the solution they envisioned?
We've been working for a long time in support of the moderate opposition in Syria.
It hasn't worked.
These things, as we've said, take time. They're difficult. They're complicated. But the main issue is to get a result. And if other countries can play a positive role in achieving a political transition and helping end the conflict, that's a good thing. And whether those countries are partners in the Gulf, neighbors of Syria, or Russia, Iran, or others, if everyone is working toward a positive result of ending the conflict through a political transition, that is a good thing.
On the military front, senior military officials of the administration are announcing a new plan to have several advisors on the ground in Syria for the first time to try to help some rebels. We've seen U.S. military shipments to the rebels increase. Is the U.S. putting more pressure on the ground and eventually boots on the ground to try maybe to push for that political solution?
What we're doing is increasing the pressure on Daesh, on ISIL, both in Iraq and in Syria, and helping those who are working to fight them. In Iraq, we've made significant progress over the last year. Think of this. A year ago, when we first brought this coalition together, which is now more than 65 countries, Baghdad was under threat, Erbil was under threat, they had lost the Mosul Dam, they had lost Tikrit. Now, Baghdad is not under threat, Erbil is safe, the Mosul Dam is back, 85% of the population of Tikrit is back. Daesh is down 30% in terms of the territory
controls Ramadi and Mosul.
It does, but it controls...
We've heard promises that they would be retaken swiftly. This hasn't happened.
It controls more than 30% less territory today than it did 1 year ago. That's significant. The Iraqis have now regained Beji and the oil refinery, and they are moving on Ramadi.
The U.S. is going to be more present at the brigade level in Iraq, as was announced.
We will continue to support them and look for ways to increase the support. Our Secretary of Defense talked a little bit about that yesterday. In Syria, there's also progress. The border between Syria and Turkey, which is critical because that's how Daesh supplies itself, how it brings in foreign fighters, 80% of that border now has been taken back over the last 6 months quietly with the support of the coalition for forces on the ground in Syria.
So why do you need more U.S. troops on the ground if things are going so well?
Well, it's not first of all, they're not going to be U.S. troops in combat. What we're looking at, as we've said, is whether there are ways to even more effectively advise and assist those who are taking the combat.
And so on.
And the Secretary of Defense addressed some of that yesterday. There is only about 15% of the border that remains under Daesh control, and we are now working closely with the Turks in particular to retake that part of the border. And at the same time, beginning to support those groups in northern Syria who are putting pressure on Raqqa, which, as you know, is Daesh's capital. So what you're seeing, both in Iraq...
There'll be an assault soon on Raqqa?
All of that will build toward putting pressure on Raqqa. So there's pressure that's being exerted on Daesh in Iraq, pressure being exerted on Daesh in Syria, and that can change the dynamic.
Very quickly to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We've seen obviously a flare-up in violence. An agreement was brokered by John Kerry with the King of Jordan to have cameras on the holy sites in Jerusalem. Will this be enough? And just on the broader side, the U.S. has tried and failed on the issue.
Well,
this is the biggest failure.
The first issue was to deal with the crisis that erupted on the Temple Mount. And you had a terrible campaign of violence, of attacks on Israeli civilians and citizens, and also on soldiers, knife attacks, etc. That had to stop. At the same time, there was a very charged political environment that was leading to a climate in which these attacks were more likely. We worked hard to get the rhetoric decreased on both sides. We also worked hard to clarify the situation on the Temple Mount, and I think you heard very important clarifications from the leaders, all of whom wanted to take down the tension. So the first thing was getting this particular...
This has been achieved.
And for now, this has been achieved. But ultimately, what's at stake is something much larger, and that's the question of whether we can get back to a peace process that leads to a two-state solution.
It's dead now.
You know, the history of this is it's gone through very challenging periods and periods where there's been real progress. Ultimately, the United States has been deeply engaged for many years.
But that's not the case.
Well, it's up to the parties. The United States will be there.
Very quickly, are you going to try again on this issue before the end of the Obama administration?
First things first, we want to make sure that this situation on the Temple Mount is resolved. We'll be engaging intensely with the parties, including Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming to Washington in just a couple of weeks. I think certainly part of that conversation with President Obama will be to look to see what he wants to do in terms of moving a peace process forward. We're engaged with President Abbas. We will continue to gauge where the parties want to go, and if they're prepared to make difficult decisions to move forward, we'll be with them.
Okay, Antony Blinken, thank you very much for coming on the France 24 set, and thank you for watching this edition of The Interview. Stay tuned for more news.